On a frozen Tuesday morning in March, Richard Calloway signed the transfer documents with the casual efficiency of a man disposing of something he had already forgotten. $1,000. That was the number his team had placed on a garage, sitting at the rear corner of a commercial property he had acquired 4 months earlier and never personally visited. He had referred to it in a team meeting as a clearance problem and a liability he wanted removed before the quarter closed. The man who purchased it arrived without representation, without a counteroffer, and without the particular performance of confidence that people display when they are uncertain. He reviewed the contract, asked one question, signed, accepted the key, and walked back to his truck in the cold morning air without looking back. Richard said something to his assistant as they returned to their vehicle. There was laughter. 6 months later, Richard was reading a business publication at his desk when he saw the ad. Res. He read the article twice. Then he sat for a long time without doing anything else. What happened inside that garage between March and September is not a story about luck. It is a story about what it costs to look at something without actually seeing it. Nathan Briggs grew up in a house in rural Ohio, where the garage behind the house was treated with more seriousness than any other room. His father, Earl Briggs, had spent 30 years as a machinist and dedicated every hour outside that work to a restoration practice he ran quietly and without advertisement from a 2-bay structure he had built himself. Earl did not explain his methods. He demonstrated them. Nathan absorbed them the way children absorb language, not from instruction but from years of standing beside someone who worked with complete attention and expected the same from whoever was present. By 17, Nathan could diagnose mechanical failure by sound. By 20, he was sourcing components through private networks that most people in the trade did not know existed. By 24, he had completed an engineering degree, finished near the top of his class, and accepted a position at Meridian Fabrication, a mid-size firm with a specialty restoration division that required both technical precision and the hands-on instinct that either exists in a person or does not. Nathan had it fully. His colleagues trusted his assessments. His managers relied on his reports without always acknowledging the reliance. He spent 8 years there and built a professional record that should have been the foundation of something long and stable. Then the acquiring firm arrived. The restoration division did not fit the new financial model. On a Thursday evening, Nathan received an email at 11:04 p.m. informing him that his position had been eliminated. He read it at his kitchen table. He closed the screen. He sat without moving for a while. Then he opened a notebook and began writing a list. He was 32. He had $13,000 saved. He had no meaningful debt. He had tools he owned outright and understood completely. And he had, as he would say once to the one person who asked him directly, exactly one available direction: forward. He spent 5 months doing subcontract work through a property maintenance contact, work that paid consistently and required him to leave his larger intentions in the truck each morning. He looked for opportunity the way his father had taught him to look at machines, not for what was presented, but for what was actually there underneath the presentation. He was patient in the specific way of someone who has no remaining alternative to patience, and has settled that fact cleanly. Calloway Group was a commercial real estate operation that Richard Calloway had built over 14 years through acquisition velocity and an almost complete intolerance for carrying costs on assets that were not actively generating return. Richard was 46. He had the confidence of a man who had been right consistently enough that uncertainty had become for him largely academic. He was not unkind. He was efficient, which produces in practice many of the same outcomes. In December, he acquired a parcel of older industrial land on the northeastern edge of the city as part of a portfolio transaction. The parcel came with a complication. At its rear corner sat a garage structure roughly 870 square feet, built in the early 1960s, with a poured foundation, a corrugated roof that had partially failed at the eastern seam, a roll-up door inoperable for 3 years, and an electrical system a site assessor described in 4 words: non-functional, full replacement required. Richard's team put demolition and clearance at $11,000 to $15,000. Richard had no interest in spending $15,000 on a structure that contributed nothing to the disposition. The idea of selling it separately was raised briefly. Richard approved it without deliberation. Price: it to move. Nathan heard about the garage from a woman named Sandra Cole, who operated a small materials supply business and who had serviced Callaway Group contractors on prior projects. She mentioned it at the end of an unrelated conversation, without weight or emphasis. Old commercial garage, northeastern edge, poor condition, price to clear. Nathan asked for the intersection. He drove out the next morning before sunrise. He parked across the street and did not immediately get out. The temperature was near freezing. He sat and looked at the structure for close to 20 minutes. He was not cataloging damage. He was reading the foundation line, the lot dimensions, the position of the structure on the parcel, and the address itself. He knew this area. He had done assessment work nearby 2 years earlier, and he had a precise memory of what the city's infrastructure planning documents had indicated about this corridor's development classification. He knew what was adjacent. He knew what was 12 to 18 months away from public announcement. He knew what that combination meant for land values in the surrounding blocks. He got out and walked the exterior. He pressed his palm to the concrete block at the south wall. He crouched at the foundation corner and looked. He assessed the roof failure as serious, but not structural. He stood at the gap in the side entrance frame and looked into the dark interior with his eyes adjusting. There were shapes inside that did not belong to an empty building. Large, covered, arranged in rows. He called the contact number that afternoon and arranged a viewing. Richard arrived with his site coordinator and a contractor present to confirm clearance estimates. He wore the expression of someone completing an administrative obligation. Nathan arrived alone and early, with a notebook and a flashlight. Richard assessed him in the brief, efficient way of someone who believes the relevant information is already apparent and cared in a flat tone whether he was there about salvage or purchase. Nathan said he wanted to see the interior. Richard unlocked the side entrance. Inside, Richard narrated deficiencies with practiced brevity. Roll-up door failed for 3 years. Electrical entirely non-functional. Roof partially open at the east. Site assessment flagged possible foundation movement in the northwest quadrant. Price was $1,000 with full liability waiver and a vacate clause requiring exit within 18 months, if development on the surrounding parcel received formal approval. He said this without softening, in the manner of a man communicating disposal terms rather than conducting a negotiation. Nathan moved through the interior with his flashlight, wall to wall, corner to corner. He pressed his hands to the block walls. He read the floor. He looked at the ceiling joists. He spent 13 minutes. Then he stopped at the far end of the space where several large objects sat beneath tarps lay, earred with years of dust and the stillness of things that have not been disturbed in a very long time. He stood in front of them. He did not lift the tarps. He noted the dimensions of each one carefully. He noted the spacing. He noted what the dimensions told him. He came back to the entrance and asked one question. How much? Richard repeated the figure without adjustment. $1,000. As though clarity on the number was the only remaining courtesy required, Nathan agreed without negotiating. He signed at a folding table near the gate with the wind moving across the lot and Richard's contractor watching from several feet away. When the key was in his jacket pocket, Richard said to his coordinator, in a voice that carried to the small group, that he had just solved a clearance problem at a profit. There was quiet laughter. The group walked to their cars. Nathan stood at the gate for a moment. Then he turned, walked the exterior one final time, stopped at the side entrance gap, left, ooked through it at the covered shapes for 3 seconds, and walked to his truck. He returned the next morning at 5:30 with a heavy flashlight, a full set of hand tools, a pry bar, and his notebook. He did not begin with the structure. He began with the tarps. There were 8 of them in varying sizes, layered, tied with rope, coated in the residue of a sealed building left untouched for years. He pulled the first one back slowly in the manner of someone who is confident in what they will find but cannot absorb the cost of being mistaken. Underneath was a car. He worked through all 8 in under 30 minutes. 8 automobiles arranged in 2 rough rows, every one of them covered and left in a building that Callaway Group's assessment team had entered, evaluated, and classified as an empty demolition target, without once looking beneath the coverings over the most significant contents of the space. Nathan stood in the center of those 8 cars with his flashlight moving forward, from one to the next, and said nothing aloud. The first car he cleared enough dust to read was a 1967 Ford Mustang Fastback, surface rust on the quarters. paint failing in wide sections, chrome trim fully present, glass intact. He opened the driver's door and read the odometer. He checked the VIN plate. He opened the hood. Engine block present, no catastrophic failure visible, all major components accounted for. He wrote 4 numbers in his notebook and closed the hood gently with both hands. The second car required crouching to read the badge from the correct angle. A 1969 Chevrolet Camaro Z28, a production variant that serious collectors pursued with the intensity reserved for things that exist in genuinely limited numbers. Frame number readable, trim intact. He drew a circle around the number he wrote down. Cars 3 through 5 were American sedans from the late 1950s and early 1960s, all recoverable, all carrying real market value after correct restoration, though not at the left, vel of the first 2. The 6th car stopped him. He had to clear dust with both hands and look at the badge under direct flashlight from close range to confirm the reading. A 1970 Plymouth Hemi Cuda, a vehicle of such documented rarity that the number of confirmed surviving examples was a subject of active ongoing research among collectors. Finding one in any condition was uncommon. Finding one in a forgotten structure with its body intact and its numbers matching drivetrain present was not the kind of thing that announces itself. It simply sits under a tarp in a building a company sold for $1,000 because no one on their assessment team looked past what was on the surface. The last 2 cars had floor pan damage beyond economic repair, but they carried usable period-correct components, and components had their own value in a market where sourcing correct parts for serious restorations was the primary constraint on the work. He sat on a wooden crate in the center of those 8 cars with his notebook open on his knee. His rough estimate, calculated conservatively against current private market values for correctly restored examples with documented provenance, sat between $420,000 and $580,000 in realized value if the restorations were executed at the level the vehicles deserved. He had paid $1,000 for the building and everything inside it. He walked the surrounding blocks that afternoon. That evening he called a former colleague now working in municipal planning and asked a single neutral question about the development zone classification for that corridor. The answer confirmed what he had already calculated before signing the document at the folding table. The entire block sat within a Phase 2 commercial development priority zone. Within 14 to 20 months, the infrastructure program would be publicly announced, and land values in the zone would shift accordingly. He ended the call, sat at his kitchen table, looked at the number S in his notebook, and for the first time since the evening he read that email at 11:04 p.m., he allowed himself to smile without reservation. He called his former colleague Owen the next morning. He said only that he had found something, that there was no immediate salary, and that he believed it would be worth the time. Owen asked what Nathan had paid for the property. Nathan told him. Owen asked him to repeat the number. Nathan did. There was a pause. Owen said he would be there at 7. The first 2 months were the kind of work that does not produce visible results and demands everything a person has available. They worked from before sunrise to well after dark on most days. Nathan slept in the building during the first 3 weeks to reduce his expenses, a cot near the south wall where the wind did not cut through. The Mustang required a crankshaft assembly sourced through a private supplier in Indiana with a 3-week lead time, during which they moved to preparation woe. RK on the Camaro and the Cuda, disassembling, cleaning, cataloging, and building the part inventory that the restorations would require. By the end of the first month, Nathan had $800 remaining in his account. He said nothing about this to Owen. He took 2 nights of subcontract towing work through an impound contact to cover the next materials order. One evening in the middle of April, a section of the eastern roof seam opened in a heavy rainstorm and water came directly into the Camaro's engine bay, which they had fully disassembled for inspection. Owen put his fist on the workbench and said several things at volume. Nathan found 2 additional tarps and covered everything exposed. He cleaned the water with rags. He returned to what he had been working on. Owen watched him for a moment. Then Owen picked up his tools and went back to work as well. There was a night in the 5th week when Nathan sat alone in the building late and took out a notebook that had belonged to his father. R.L. Briggs had written in it over 28 years of working on machines, observations and measurements, and short plain sentences that had settled into the pages the way certainty settles into a person who has worked at something long enough to stop doubting it. On a page near the center, in his father's direct handwriting, was one sentence. Asterisk when the room looks empty. Look again. Asterisk Nathan had read it many times. Sitting in a cold building in April with $800 in his account, and 8 covered cars around him, and a roof that was letting in rain. It was the most accurate financial statement he had ever encountered. He took out a pen and wrote below it in his own hand, asterisk $1,000, March. This is where it starts. Asterisk, he closed the notebook and placed it in the inside pocket of his jacket where it remained for the duration of the project. By the end of May, the Mustang was complete, not modified, not updated, restored correctly to its original factory specification at the level that serious collector RS require, the level that makes a car worth what it is worth, because it is precisely what it was. Owen drove it out of the garage on a Saturday morning with the sun just clearing the buildings across the street. He turned the key, the engine caught on the second crank, and settled into an idle that was deep and authoritative and entirely correct. Nathan stood at the open roll-up, with his arms folded, and listened for a full minute. Owen moved the throttle once, and the exhaust note moved through the morning air, in a way that communicated something that no number in a notebook had yet captured. Nathan said only that it was right and walked back inside. He posted a single listing on a private forum used by serious collectors of American muscle. No auction platform, no open marketplace, a precise description, accurate vehicle history, restoration documentation, and a contact number. He received 12 inquiries in 72 hours. The one he prioritized came from a collector named Arthur Dean, 63 years old, who had spent a decade building one of the more serious private collections of documented American performance vehicles in the northeastern region. Arthur asked precise questions about the Verthverstauin, the original build documentation, the specific suppliers used for each restoration phase. Nathan answered each one at the same level of precision Arthur brought to asking them. Arthur arranged an in-person inspection and arrived with his own technical consultant, a retired Ford engineer who spent 2 hours under the car and around the engine bay with a boroscope and a reference binder, and said very little. The consultant told Arthur quietly that the restoration was, in his assessment, among the most correct he had encountered outside a professional museum program. Arthur shook Nathan's hand and offered $91,000. Nathan accepted. The wire transfer cleared 4 days later. Owen saw the notification on Nathan's phone and grabbed him by the shoulder. Nathan allowed it for approximately 2 seconds, nodded once, and walked back to the workbench to continue on the Camaro. Arthur said something before leaving the lot that became the structural foundation of everything that followed. He told Nathan that he had a circle of collectors actively seeking restoration work, executed at this standard, and that if Nathan came across anything worthy, he should call before listing publicly. Nathan said he appreciated that. What he did not tell Arthur was that he had 6 more vehicles in the building directly behind him, at least 2 of which Arthur would almost certainly want himself. Within 6 months of signing a $1,000 contract on a building a company had classified as a demolition liability, Merit Autoworks, the name Nathan registered in April, had generated $390,000 in vehicle sale revenue, acquired 3 adjacent land parcels at pre-announcement pricing totaling $58,000, received a formal independent valuation on those parcels, following the Phase 2 infrastructure announcement that placed their combined value at $490,000, and held active restoration contracts totaling $160,000 in confirmed work from clients in Arthur Dean's collector network. The total net asset value of the operation, accounting for equipment, property, outstanding contracts, and the 2 remaining restorable vehicles still in process, exceeded $1 million. Owen Parker had been offered a formal equity position in the company, which he accepted without requiring a long conversation. Nathan submitted building permits for a permanent multi-bay facility on the consolidated lot. He named the project on the permit application documents, Merit Autoworks, Building 1. He went back to the garage alone on an evening in late September after the crew had left for the day, not to work, just to stand in it. The roof had been fully replaced in June. The floor had been cleaned, sealed, and painted. The roll-up door operated on a new motor, the electrical system with as entirely new. The space was organized and lit and alive in a way it had not been since its original construction. He walked to the eastern corner where he had first pressed his hand against the wall on the morning of the tarps and the flashlight and the notebook. He had told his crew during the renovation to leave that section of wall unpainted. His crew chief had asked why. Mathan had said only that it was the most important part of the building. He stood in front of it for a while. Then he turned off the bay lights, locked the roll-up, and walked to his truck. People who heard the story later, and many people heard it because a journalist named Clara Frost wrote a piece that ran in 3 regional publications and was picked up by 2 national outlets, often asked Nathan what the lesson was. He gave different answers depending on who was asking. To other tradespeople, he said that institutional loyalty is not an asset you can liquidate when you need it, so build the thing you can. Build with your own hands. To younger people, he said that being dismissed is not the same as being wrong. The shortest answer he gave, and the one that appeared in print most often, was this: look more carefully before you decide. In the notebook in his jacket pocket, below his father's handwriting and below his own entry from March, he wrote something longer. He wrote that Richard Calloway had looked at the garage and seen the cost of it, and called that value, and that he had looked at the same garage and tried to see what was underneath the cost. He wrote that neither of them had been irrational. They had simply been trained to look for different things, and in that one transaction, on that one cold morning, the difference between those 2 ways of seeing had been worth $1,000 on one side of the ledger and everything else on the other. He closed the notebook. Outside the small office window he had set up in the corner of the garage, the lights of Merritt Ottawa KS were still on. Through the wall he could hear the slow, regular pulse of a compressor running in the back bay, the sound of a shop that was working. That was alive. That had been built from a decision made in the cold with a key in a jacket pocket and a very specific way of looking at things that other people had already decided were not worth looking at. The garage that Richard Calloway had sold for $1,000 turned out to be worth considerably more than that. It turned out to be worth everything.